Welcome to the Love Lab Podcast, a safe and fun place to get real and learn about sex. Whether you're a man or woman, single or couple, this is the show for you. I am your host, Kevin Anthony, and I am here to guide you to go from good to amazing in the bedroom and your relationships. All right, welcome back to the Love Lab Podcast. This is episode 287, and it is titled The Sex Education the Church Didn't Want You to Have. Now, before we get started here, I'm sure that many of my listeners are people that belong to a certain faith. And I want to assure you, I'm not here to absolutely destroy your religion and tell you how it's all evil and wrong. That's not the purpose of this show. However, having grown up with a religious upbringing myself, I am well aware of some of the shortcomings of these institutions. And that's what we want to talk about today, specifically as it pertains to sex. We want to talk about, what did the church teach us? How did that work out for us later in life? How did that serve us or not serve us? And what potentially could they have done better? And a whole lot more. Between my own personal experience and the experience of my guests who are on the show today, I think we're going to be able to dig into that pretty well. But before we do that, a short word from my sponsor. Power and Mastery 3.0 is here. The men's sexual mastery program you have heard about on this show for a long time is now even better. I've personally reviewed every module, lesson, video, audio, and PDF to see if there's anything new that needed to be added. As a result, I have added 10 new videos, 1 new audio, 8 new PDFs, and dozens of links to handpicked products to help support your journey to mastery. In addition, there is also a brand new user interface that makes it easier to navigate the course and find your course materials. So if you are ready to become the sexual master you have always wanted to be, then go now to powerandmastery.com. Okay, my guests today are Julia Postema and Jeremiah Gibson, and they are the co-hosts of the podcast Sex Evangelicals, the sex education the church didn't want you to have. They are both Boston-based licensed psychotherapists and certified sex therapists who work with clients in Massachusetts. They currently live in, oh boy, I'm going to mess this one up. You can correct me later. Utrecht, the Netherlands. They specialize in helping couples navigate religious backgrounds, discover sexuality that works for their partnership. They enjoy traveling to places that tend to fly under the radar, long-distance hiking, cooking very spicy food, unexpected conversations, and introverted days filled with reading and drinking fancy tea. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. We are excited.
And well done for saying Utrecht.
Oh, thank you.
That was better than me. I was thinking, he even had the accent.
Utrecht. Yeah.
Perfect.
Whew, man, I saw that word in there and I'm like, oh man, that's going to be a tough one.
No, you were amazing.
All right. So, I'm not even going to do any more intro. I just want to jump right in because I was going to say something about your backgrounds, and instead, let's just start there. Let's start with telling the audience first about your professional backgrounds, and then I want to get into your religious backgrounds after that. But one thing at a time. Let's just let people know sort of who you are, what you do, and why you're here to talk about this today from a professional background.
Yeah. So Julia and I are both licensed psychotherapists. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Julia is a licensed independent clinical social worker. We're also certified sex therapists through the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. Long titles, all that to say we've done a lot of training. We've done a lot of our own work. We've done a lot of supervision about how to help people navigate relationships and build communication strategies that work best for them. And as we have developed in our professional careers, we've both kind of independently, and then more so when we met each other 5 years ago, have moved into wanting to specialize in relational health and then in sexual health. And Julia, as you and I met 5 years ago, we started Sex Evangelicals as a hobby podcast about 3 years ago, and it's slowly morphing into what we want to be our full-time business. We have learned just how intrinsically interconnected negative messages about sexuality, bodies, desire, and religious upbringings have been. And not just for folks who grew up in the church, but also for folks who didn't grow up in the church, who were impacted by who were impacted by abstinence-only sex education movements in public schools in the 90s and 2000s. So this is a pretty big population that we're talking to here. Our
Oh,
tag
for sure.
one of the things that we say on our podcast quite a bit is you don't have to have grown up in the church to have been fucked over by the church.
Well, that's true. Julia, anything you want
So-
to add to that about background before I move on to your religious backgrounds?
That's a great start. I might add more later, but I love how you said that.
Awesome. Okay. So we've established then your backgrounds as far as your expertise in this particular area professionally. But what we're going to talk about a lot in this episode as well is your own personal experiences with these things. And so maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about your religious background. And we don't necessarily need yet to dive into the specific things they taught you, because we're going to get to that, but just a little bit about that. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about the actual religion, you don't have to say which one it was, but that's up to you. I mean, you certainly can share that if you want.
Sure. I grew up in a independent fundamentalist Baptist community. That was my church of background. I also went to a tiny private Christian school. It was a part of the classical Christian education system. We can definitely chat more about the uniqueness of that later in the podcast. And then the third structure that really informed my experience was a Christian camp. So between those three structures, the camp, the school, and the church, I had very, very little exposure to anything outside of Christianity, and not just mainstream Christianity, but a more fringy version of that.
Mm-hmm. And you, Jeremiah?
Yeah, I grew up in a denomination called the Churches of Christ. Churches of Christ are an interesting denomination in the evangelical church because, on the one hand, they very much adhere to some of the values around gender, around sexuality that other more mainstream evangelical churches do, such as like the Southern Baptist Church, the Presbyterian churches, things like that. They have their own like really interesting, almost libertarian flair to it, which having left the Church of Christ like for I've been out now for about 6 years, is really interesting to kind of look at. We can talk about that a little bit later if you want, but yeah, I worked in churches. My first career is actually as a music minister. Worked full time at a church for about 5 years in West Texas, pretty big church. Moved to Boston in 2010. Ended up working at another church for about 7 years. And then while that happened, I also became a sex therapist. And I was in a situation where I had to pick one or the other because the church ended up firing me for what I said about some of my views about sexuality. So I got kicked out of the church. Julia left more willingly, I think, than I did.
Well, that is actually fascinating. And I'm so glad I asked that question. See, sometimes, when I'm writing these questions, like I look at it, I'm like, okay, I want to know this, but I don't want to spend a ton of time, with the whole who are you kind of thing. Like I really want to give the audience, value in the content. But I'm so glad I asked that question, because it would not be strange to assume that you had more of the religious background that most of us had, which is, when we were little, we grew up in the church. We had experiences that sent us on a certain path. Many of us walked away from the church very young, right? And then, so what we're talking about here is all based on our experience maybe as children. But what I'm hearing from both of you is that you spent a significantly longer amount of time in these systems, especially Jeremiah.
Especially me, yeah.
Yeah, being so integrated in and working for churches and really being part of that. And so what I think is great about that is when people hear this show, when they listen to this, they're not going to say, oh, that was just, their childhood experience. And then, that's it. Like you have I don't want to make any assumptions about how old you are. There's a lot of gray in this beard here too. So I'm probably at least as old as you, maybe older. But the point is that you've had a lifetime to experience this, in addition to the work that you do professionally. And so I really wanted people to understand that, because when we start getting deep into the material here, this isn't coming from a little bit of experience. It's coming from a lot of experience.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, thanks for naming that.
Okay, so let's jump in now then and talk about and you both get an opportunity to answer this. This can go in a lot of directions, and I don't know where it's going to go. But I just want to start with, what are some of the biggest things when it pertains to sex that the church taught you that you believe they got wrong?
Yes. I agree with you. We could probably both answer this in a lot of different directions. Our first series on our podcast is called The 7 Deadly Sexual Sins According to the Church. And we break down 7 of the primary sins that we and many folks were taught would be deeply, deeply damaging. The 2 that stand out to me as foremost, and the 2 that impacted my life the most significantly, were 1, don't have sex before you get married, and don't be gay. Now, even the labeling of those 2 quote unquote sins is problematic when we, as all sexual health professionals, could break down what does sex mean and use some queer theory here. All that to say, as a small child, that created a massive culture of both shame and anxiety. So what I tell folks is that don't have sex before you get married is certainly something that people learn in abstinence-only education. But if you grow up in more of a community of faith that teaches these messages, it goes far deeper than don't have sex before you get married. For me, as a small child, that meant being 8, 9, 10 years old, prepubescent, and having conversations with my friends about whether or not spaghetti straps were sinful, because God forbid that I, as a child, be a stumbling block for the uncontrollable urges of adult men. So those sins run really, really deep.
Oh man, the things you just said there. Yeah, you're right. They run really, really deep. That last little bit, I'm not even sure I want to touch it just yet.
That's okay.
Because that is a really deep piece that you just shared. And that's actually going to be related to, after we finish this question, my next question is going to be related to that last thing that you just talked about. But what I really wanted to get back to is one of the things that I and my wife, when she was alive, we really worked a lot with clients, was the sexual shame piece.
Yes.
And what you just mentioned is this is one of the main roots for where that sexual shame comes from.
Absolutely. Yes. And it is so pervasive.
That's right.
Yeah. And I don't want to get too far off the topic, but could you maybe just share why that shame is such a problem?
Yeah. I remember being probably around the same age that I just described, around 9. And I remember, and I don't remember the reason for this, but I remember being in the bathroom and touching my vulva, touching my vagina. I actually wasn't trying to masturbate. I just wanted to know what existed in my own body. And then I had what I now know to be a panic attack. And I confessed this sin to my mother that, oh my goodness, I touched my body. And so that indicates the level of the shame and anxiety that the messaging from Christian cultures creates, because it teaches you that your body is bad, that you in and of yourself are a temptation to yourself and to other people, and that any thought or desire around sexuality before you get married is inherently wrong. And of course, as all 3 of us know, when those messages are embedded for years, for decades, when you get married or you choose to enter into sexual spaces, you can't quite overcome that.
Yeah, that's a huge piece, and that's something obviously we see in the work that we do, which is that these are things that got ingrained in us when we were very, very young, but yet they affect us all the way through our adult lives, and they actually damage the way that we are able to show up in our relationships. Not only our relationship to ourselves, but our relationship to our partners. It damages both of those. Okay, before we go too much further down that road, Jeremiah, I'm curious from your perspective, some of the big things that religion taught you that you felt they got wrong.
Same as what Julia mentioned. I think so. So 2 things stand out. One, wanting to name real quick the other sexual sins. Don't have wants, and that's particularly for women. Don't watch porn. That was directed particularly towards men. Don't have sex outside of marriage, so don't commit infidelity. And just in general, don't talk about sex. So those are the other sexual sins that we talk about on the podcast. Julia, I may be missing out on one of them. I wrote them down trying to in my notes trying to remember all
Yeah,
7 of
that
them. But
well, that's great. Hey, if anybody's been listening to this show for any length of time, I must be the biggest sinner because all of my work is around trying to reverse all of those things you just
sure,
said.
sure.
Right.
Well, and so the second thing that I would mention is that a lot of this messaging is directed towards women. Women are much more likely, though not exclusively, much more likely to be victims of some of the language and some of the dictates of purity culture than men are. So my version of this was I was in a 15-year-long relationship before I met Julia, and that started sophomore year of college. And we had initial sexual experiences, age 19, age 20, and they were followed by panic attacks. And in our case, your question about shame, something else that happens around shame prevents people from having honest conversations about what's going on, and then honest conversations about the systems that negatively impacted you and your own like sense of accountability in terms of like how you have been impacted by them, how you've chosen to act in harmful ways that kind of align with the larger dictates of the Christian messages as well. So that was something in my 15-year-long marriage we were never able to recover from.
Yeah, and that
And
is
it was rooted around silence. It was rooted around like the inability to talk about hard things.
Yeah, and that is absolutely one of the big problems that shows up in relationships down the line when you've had that kind of programming, for sure. My next question, you've kind of already gone there, so let's just go there now. My follow-up question was, were there differences in the messaging that you got? Because, you have obviously a man and a woman here, and you both grew up in slightly different backgrounds, but religious backgrounds. Did you get different messaging based on your gender? From what I've heard already, I know that's the case,
Absolutely.
but could you talk a little bit more about what the differences were?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. That's a hard question because it runs so deep and for me was a part of my entire landscape as a child, adolescent, and even young adult. What I learned is that women are primarily the object of the uncontrollable urges of men. That was the language that I learned growing up. So I hate the word urges for that reason. And the language that I also learned is that women, when they don't appropriately dress modestly, that they are a stumbling block. So even that language is quite dehumanizing because it has no sense of humanity, right? You are a block and you are something that a man would trip over, and that you as a girl have, and I say girl because that's when we learned, you as a girl have to protect yourself from rape, from sexual harm, from your own desires by being modest, by being submissive. That was another big word in my church community. And then, of course, when a woman gets married, they are expected to be this sexual goddess to fill the socially conditioned fantasies of men. And that does not tend to work well for women. What I also talk about on our podcast quite a bit is, even though I'm not a man, I work quite a bit with men and with couples. And the mind fuck that men receive in these kinds of communities is that on one hand, you have these, again, strong sexual desires that are nearly uncontrollable. And that is simultaneously how God made you. So you have to embrace that. And that is also terrible. That is also the devil in you. Demonic possession was a big part of my community as well. So men simultaneously had to fight and embrace what they learned that God made them as. And you can't do both of those things at the same time. So men and women are trapped in these double binds. And when they don't have the skills to talk through it, then it gets even messier when you enter into romantic or sexual relationships.
Oh boy, let's unpack a little bit of what you just said right there. Let's go back to sort of the beginning of it, which is you had to do certain things as a woman because of the way men would react. That's shifting the blame from the man's behavior over to the women's behavior. Oh, that's a big mind fuck right there, right? Saying that
Right.
you're somehow responsible for him not being able to control his urges. Whew. Another amazing thing that you said too was they spend all this time telling you not to be sexual. And then all of a sudden one day you get married and you're just supposed to flip the switch and instantly know how to be sexual and show up for your
That's
partner
right.
with no experience whatsoever in that.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Huge, huge, huge. And then of course you brought in the part, and Jeremiah, if you want to speak to this as well, you brought in the part about the men and how it was seen more as like a demonic possession, or they have no control over their urges. All of this stuff, and unfortunately this is a big part of what churches do, but all of this stuff disempowers you as an individual. You're
That's right.
somehow
Yes.
not responsible or not able to control these things. That is quite the mind fuck, as you said.
Yeah.
Well, and just to add to that, not only are men kind of told that they're, for lack of a better term, sexual monsters, churches also expect men to be in positions of leadership, regardless of whether they want it to or not. So, for instance, and I've shared this on our podcast before, when I was 7, I was part of a Bible study. And in that Bible study were 5 or 6 families. And all of the families were opposite sex, obviously, because rule number 2, according to the church, don't be gay. And all of the kids were girls. So at any given point, I was the only boy that was there. So because many times the men, the fathers, couldn't make it, or quote, couldn't make it to Bible study. But there would be these Bible studies where we would start with singing songs, we'd start with leading prayers, and the women turned to me and said, "Well, Jeremiah, you're the boy. They didn't say this because the word penis was off limits, but they're insinuating you're the one with a penis. You're the one that leads the songs." And so little 7-year-old Jeremiah would be like, "Okay," in my like high pitchy twangy voice, and I would sing songs, and would lead a prayer and read scripture if we decided to do that. Like I learned early at 7, whether or not I wanted it or not, that people looked to me to fill in leadership vacuums, and it's a good thing that I am a decent human being, because there are plenty of situations where young boys, young men have been put into positions of leadership by family systems, by religious systems, and it hasn't turned out well. There's been a ton of harm as a result of that, as a result of the unchecked power that men are given, and ultimately that men take in these types of systems. So
Yeah,
that would be. Oh, go ahead.
That's just an interesting. That's not something that I would have thought of or would have come up in this conversation, but it's an interesting point that basically because in that system men were the leaders, you were thrust into that role, whether or not you were good at it. Fortunately, like as you said, you were a decent human being. That is another very interesting sort of aspect of this whole discussion. And I want to ask you this. It's actually not even a question on here, but it's just something that I thought of while I was listening to you. I did a show, my wife and I did a show quite a while back. It was called Sex and Spirituality, Are They Mutually Exclusive? And the idea behind that show was, it was my impression before I started researching this, that the overwhelming majority of teachings that came from the church around sexuality were not actually in the Bible or the scripture. And so my thought process on that was, well, if they weren't there in the original book, then they had to have been created by humans. Of course, the book was written by humans too. That's a whole other thing. But you see where I'm going with this, which is that these systems tend to create their own rules around sexuality that don't necessarily come from the spirituality itself. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
Sure. So one of the major sources, religiously speaking, that gets referred to is the work of Paul in the epistles. Paul is writing in a Roman context. Roman history, Roman culture, excuse me, is very aggressive. Actually, not all that different from American culture. The more that we learn about Roman culture and the more that American culture is evolving in the last 30 to 40 years. But one of the big ideas in Roman culture is this idea of dualism. Dualism is this idea that the spirit, what lives inside of us, is good, and the body is bad, and things within the body are to be rejected. That's actually not teachings from Jesus. Jesus doesn't actually say that. But Paul is talking about that and probably adheres to that to some extent, depending on who he's talking to throughout the New Testament. So that would be one of the first ideas that comes out to me is good biblical study also recognizes that these biblical writings are happening in a larger cultural context, in a context that is very different from the context that we're living in 21st century America. So I'd start there.
That's fantastic. A phrase that's fairly popular currently is the idea of spiritual, not religious. And although that's cliche, I think that points to the desire of many people to have some sort of connection outside of themselves to whatever language they would use, God, universe, etc. And so when I work with clients who have a religious background and are trying to unlearn some of the harmful messages, something that I always make clear is my value, my stake in this is your flourishing as a relational and sexual person. So if you are able to reconcile that with a spiritual or religious tradition, I will be your number one fan, because that can be a protective factor. Or if you have to make the hard choice to leave, which is also something that many people do, that is incredibly difficult. And I will also be there to support you in navigating the aftermath of that. Some people are able to find a middle ground. Depending on your background, that can be really difficult. But like you said at the beginning of the episode, our work is certainly not anti-religious. Our work is pro-sexual health, and what people do with their religion can look different depending on the relationship in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% in agreement with that message. If we tried to go out there and tell people that they need to basically throw out their entire worldview, not even worldview, universal view, creation view, in order to have good sex, they're just not going to hear that message.
Right.
And that was the goal of the episode that I did. I wanted to show people that those things were not mutually exclusive, that you could still, if you chose, believe in your faith and yet still be a healthy, functioning sexual being and have great sex and great relationships. And so I'm happy to hear that you share that. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show. From what I had seen and from when we had talked, I felt that we were pretty aligned on that. And I wanted people to hear that message from somebody with more expertise than myself. Because I left the church very, very young. Like I went to Catholic school and through 8th grade. And for about half of that, I begged my parents to please take me out of that school. Every year, please take me out of this school. Please take me out of this school. Finally, around high school time, they acquiesced, only because my older brother, who was then in Catholic high school, finally convinced them to get him out of the Catholic high school. So when it came time for me to go to high school, all right, fine. They really didn't want to do it, but I think they were just tired of us complaining about it. But that was pretty much the last, contact I had really with the church. Yeah. But I am a scholar, so to speak. I have read the Bible in my adult life, not because I necessarily was worshiping it, but because I wanted to understand it and know what it said and how so much of the world is based on that book, how it runs and the people who believe it. I wanted to understand it. I've read the Satanic Bible too, because I wanted to understand that. I'm like, I want to know what the other side's thinking. How's their mind work, right? So, but I didn't spend as much time in the church. I didn't work for a church. Like I couldn't quote that scripture that you just quoted, Jeremiah. So that's why it's so helpful to have you here to share these ideas, because it comes from a very knowledgeable place. So I appreciate that. Okay. We're about halfway through the show. I want to just pause for a break, and then I want to come back and talk about how these teachings affected your own personal relationships throughout your life. Okay. Hey guys, you know what makes a man great? You know the kind of masculine man that women are irresistibly attracted to and want. Is it money, job title, his physical body? Is it because he's great and better, has a big penis? But what if you don't have those or only some of them? What if you've had a string of failed relationships, are embarrassed by your bedroom skills, doubt whether you can rise to the occasion, worry about lasting long enough, or are always stuck in the friend zone? I can help you if you're ready to make big changes and finally become the man you have always wanted to be. Then this is the program for you. To find out more, please go to kevinandceline.com/go/warrior. The link is in the description. That is kevinandceline.com/go/warrior. Okay, so we talked about your professional backgrounds. We talked about your religious backgrounds. We talked about some of the teachings that you feel the church got wrong. We talked about differences in how women were taught sexuality in these religious institutions versus men. I'm curious now, how did that affect the way you were able to have both a sexual relationship with yourself, primarily when you were younger, and then as you got older, how that affected your relationships?
Yeah. I like that you included relationship with yourself and partners. So I did not masturbate growing up because that was evil, or so I learned. And I also got married very young at 22. Now, many people in my church community got married earlier than that, 17 or not 17, 18, 19, 20, that kind of thing. But 22, I still think is very young. And I remember being engaged and I was pumped to get married primarily because I wanted to have shame-free sexual experiences. And what I learned is that sex would magically be great after you got married if you followed all the rules. Now, of course, sex was vaginally penetrative intercourse, and I didn't think during my engagement, despite all the premarital counseling at our church, about, I have no idea what feels good to me sexually because I have never explored that. But I am sure that I am going to get the honeymoon sex that my church promised me.
How'd that work out for you?
I did not. I cried every single day on my honeymoon because it was sex, but it was more than sex. I learned that my worth as a woman was in becoming a wife, and most importantly, in being a wife, being sexually desirable to my husband. And we struggled quite a bit. We eventually did find a good sex therapist years after getting married. The relationship did not survive, and I don't think that means that either one of us failed. But what makes me incredibly sad when I think about that relationship is, I wonder what might have been different if we had sexual and relational tools to set us up for success. We didn't, and the relationship ended. And not only did the relationship end, but the communities that didn't teach me about sexuality, the communities that didn't teach me about relationships, actually shamed me. And that was a triple blow, I suppose, when I think about the sexual losses, the relational losses with my ex-husband, and then also the judgment from many church communities.
Yeah.
Whew, yeah. You said a lot of things in there, but what was really sort of impacting me was like sort of the triple blow, right? Like all of those things, just one on top of another, and how, I don't really know, because I didn't ask you and you haven't shared it yet, really how, like how you dealt with that later on, but and we don't necessarily even have to go there. But it seems to me like that much stuff piled on top probably took a long time to unwind.
Absolutely. Yes, a long time.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share more about that later, but I want to make sure you've got the chance to talk about. your own experiences with sexuality and relationships with yourself and others.
Yeah, Kevin, in your question that you asked, I'm thinking about a couple of different kind of branches here. One branch is, Julia, very much what you experienced. You received very overt messages that were discriminatory, that were shame-based, that were negative about your sexuality. And then there's another branch where what happens when you don't talk about sexuality at all? And that was more of my experience. So my parents, in good news, they didn't say anything negative about sexuality, which is great. In not so good news, they also didn't say anything about sexuality. And that was also largely true with my church community. There were definitely messages around gender and performativity of gender, which we can talk about a little bit later, but there weren't particularly, at least that I remember, any overt messages about sexuality. It was just kind of taken for granted that, oh, like we're gonna all participate in abstinence-only education, but nobody in my church participated in like the more overt, like true love waits, or the other kind of examples of purity culture. So how does that then impact me? Your question about relationship with self, I began masturbating when I was 13, and my masturbatory experiences almost exclusively happened in bed with my pillow over my head, wrapped up blankets around me, and then I would masturbate and try to be as quiet as I could. And so even the act of that, masturbation in secret, and that's something that continued. That's something that continued throughout college in various senses. So that was my relationship with myself. I could have a relationship with myself, but I did whatever I could to keep it secret, to keep it quiet. I didn't want anyone to walk in on me and to say anything negative. And I think that also impacted like early dating experiences as well. I had plenty of opportunities, I think, to date other people that were interested in me, and I was scared shitless, quite frankly. Just that I didn't have either the relationship skills or I suppose, for lack of a better term, kind of the ethereal blessing from God to move into that, because church is very much kind of a part of my life. As a teenager, spent a lot of time doing church related things. So definitely impacted my adolescence in those two ways. And then once I got to be married, like Julia, similar to what you were saying, I had hoped that I had hoped that getting married would be an end to the panic attacks that happened during our dating relationship. And for a few years, they actually ended. But instead, the first year and a half was actually pretty good. And then about a year, 18 months in, there was a lot of criticism. And I actually ended up receiving a lot of criticism from my ex about being too sexual, about, quote, always wanting sex, with the assumption underneath that my sexuality was dangerous. And then there was that set up a fairly long experience where we had a sexual dynamic in which we had sex. We both we kind of tacitly agreed to it, but we didn't talk about it. And so when I started studying as a sex therapist, one of the first things that I learned about was consent, and learned that consent is a relational process between two people, and being able to talk about sex. And my initial thought after that class was, oh, fuck. I have done this wrong. I have completely harmed my ex. I am a sexual monster. And so I tried to talk with my ex about that. I'd like to go to therapy. Can we talk? She's like, but I need to go to therapy. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Which, again, speaks to a different kind of shame and unwillingness to have hard conversations. And then that the relationship kind of went off a cliff for the 2 years that followed that. But yeah, a lot of pain in my own in the 15-year marriage relationship.
Yeah, and that's really why I want to have this conversation today, because at the end of the day, whether we're talking about, what the church did or didn't do, at the end of the day, it causes real harm to people and their relationships. And both of you experienced a lot of pain that you could have avoided had you had better education in this area. And Jeremiah, my experience was very similar to yours in a sense that in the Catholic Church, it was don't talk about it. It was
Sure.
never brought up. It was never talked about in
Right.
any way whatsoever. So as a young person, you are left to try to figure it out on your own. And that generally turns into a disaster. So many
Right.
things that could have been avoided, so much hurt on both sides if we had just been given proper information, and we could have made better decisions.
And not just proper information, but also proper skills to
Yes.
learn too. Because sex education is not just learning a bunch of facts about anatomy, although that's definitely helpful. It's not about learning different types of sexual activities or different types of orientations or arrangement structures, although that's helpful. Like sex education is about communication. It's about how you communicate what it is that you want, which means giving yourself permission to sit with yourself and ask yourself the question, what is it that you want? And the absence of those, among other things, the absence of those communication skills also makes it really, really hard for people to have effective sexual experiences. And that's, Julia, what you and I are doing, and why we're so invested in the work of couples therapy, is that couples therapy is ultimately about practicing those communication skills that you didn't learn in your systems of origin, families, religious, school, etc.
Yeah. The next question on my list, which we can now just skip because you already talked about it, was why is it so important to talk about it?
Yeah.
One of the things that so many people, whether they be people who listen to the podcast, watch my YouTube channel, or work with us, one of the things that they always used to say to both my wife and I, and now just me, is that they would always say that because we would come out and talk so openly about every part of our sex lives and sex in general, that they finally had permission to start to talk about it themselves.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the reasons that we want to talk about sex on our podcast as well. We have an episode coming up. It's end of January when we're recording this. We have an episode coming up this week about how to call audibles. And our own experiences of that, how to make transitions, how to do that on the fly, and how to do that in a relational way. We want to talk about not just relational health from an academic standpoint, but also from our own personal relationship.
Yeah.
And that very easily ties. Relational health is sexual health.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
can very quickly tie into the sexual relationship. So,
So, all right, we're gonna shift into, since we're getting close to the end of the show, we're gonna shift into the solutions portion of the show here. And the first question is going to be a tough one. I wouldn't want to be on your end, but I don't expect any of these institutions to change one bit. However, based on your experience, what could these institutions potentially do that could maybe at least limit some of the damage that these teachings create?
A dream that I have would be to host conference is the best word I can think of, although I don't think it's the best word. Conferences with churches in which folks are able to share their experiences of growing up with restrictive messages around gender, sexuality, and relationships, a bit like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we know in South Africa, in which people are able to say, this is what happened, here's how it harmed me, and to have folks who perpetuated that to not respond defensively, and not even to say what their intentions were, because I believe that the adults who taught me these messages were probably trying to help me. It harmed me, but I give them the benefit of the doubt. But if folks in those systems really want to help the healing process, then first and foremost, they need to hear what happened and how it was harmful. And then if they're really willing to put their money where their mouth is to be able to pay for the therapy, the sexual health therapy of some of the folks who need it. I have spent thousands of dollars in my own sex therapy, well worth it. I also have the privilege of being able to afford it. Not everybody does have the privilege to be able to afford it. So those are two very practical things that I would suggest. Host some sort of event in which people can share about their experiences without a retort, and offer to sponsor the therapy of folks who are trying to heal.
And Julia and I hope this is okay to say, would like to offer to facilitate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremiah, anything you want to add to that you think churches could do better?
Yeah, I'm thinking about Julia and I talk a lot about the distinction between values and behaviors. And a lot of the values that I have, so values around compassion, around hospitality, around curiosity, maybe a little less of curiosity, around kindness, around sacrifice. Like these are all values that I learned in the church. And one of the things that I would invite the church to do is to talk about sexuality more from the perspective of values, more from the perspective of what does it mean to have a compassionate interaction between two people. Because what the church doesn't start with values, they start with behaviors. This is the whole idea of the 7 deadly sexual sins, according to the church, is that they are sins. They're not values, they're behaviors that happen. And when you start with behaviors, it's a lot harder to work backwards and to talk about the values and the traits that might be informing those behaviors, the intentions, the desires, the hopes, the goals that might be informing those types of behaviors. Then it is, if you kind of zoom out, talk about the values that you want to have, talk about the values that are important to your partner, what alignment might be there for two people. And then two people or more people can work together to figure out, okay, what types of behaviors might work given the shared values that we have.
Wow, when I threw that question at you, I was feeling a little bad because I was like, man, if they didn't already think about this, like what a huge question to ask, right? But you both knocked it right out of the park. Like both of those are fantastic ideas. So I would love if somebody in these organizations could hear this. I doubt that they will because they probably are not listening to my show. But
Probably
maybe,
not.
Probably not listening to our show either, but
yeah, maybe somehow somebody will send it to them and they'll start to get that message. Aside from that, though, because we don't have any control over those institutions and what they may or may not do, the people listening to this, I'm wondering if you could each give them some advice. If they've had this kind of a background, if they've experienced these types of problems in their relationships, in their own life, what can they specifically do that could help with this?
yeah.
If a person is in some sort of partnership, I would say that the first step is being able to start conversations, which is basic, but basic doesn't mean easy. You had mentioned that you and your wife would share about your own sexual experiences. If you can talk about sex well, you can probably talk about anything well.
Right.
So Jeremiah and I will talk with couples about setting up some sort of structured conversation in which they can dip their toe into the waters of sexuality. And the first conversation about sexuality would be a small conversation, not because they are not capable of having a bigger conversation, but because these messages that restrict and disempower us run really, really deep. So find your partner or partners, set a timer, find a location, a time that works for you, name one very specific thing that you'll discuss, and that might be one sexual experience that you've shared that you liked together. And it doesn't have to be intercourse. It could be a kiss, a massage, something else, anything that you might have enjoyed with your partner. And then be sure to plan some sort of aftercare. Even those dip your toe into the water conversations can be really difficult. When I was married to my ex-husband, that would have been a really hard conversation for me to have at the beginning of sex therapy, even though right now, that would be the easiest thing in the world. That wasn't. That was super, super difficult. So then plan something that you can do to reconnect afterwards, if that's a game or a walk or reading in bed together or whatever else it is, after you have that vulnerability to come back together.
The other thing that I would add, just to build on that, is making sure that the content is more about the concept of pleasure and what feels good to a person. It could be, and sex could absolutely be a part of that. What feels good to the body could absolutely be a part of that. Pleasure can also happen in a lot of different ways, but thinking about what feels good for a person and centering the conversations about that, and then how can a couple work together to create experiences and then ultimately to create sustainable practices that help that help the couple, that help the relationship engage with that pleasure. And then having those conversations also opens the door to desire, to dreams. As we talked about, one of the seven deadly sexual sins is don't have wants. Part of our work that we often find in sex therapy is helping people re-engage with desire, which is re-engaging with their imaginations, re-engaging with their wants, giving themselves permission to have both of those things.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And I would also suggest, if you've had this sort of an upbringing, if you know that you've got trauma around this, you don't have to try to deal with this on your own.
That's right.
Get the help that you need, which of course leads me to, could you please share with the audience where they can find more about your work, and if they are needing support around this, how they can get it?
Absolutely. So we are online at www.sexevangelicals.com. We are taking on new clients as sex coaches. So for folks that are that live in Massachusetts, we're happy to work with couples. Feel free to reach out to us at sexevangelicals@gmail.com. The coach element means that we work with folks internationally and nationally as well. So feel free to reach out to us on the website, on email. We also have a Substack, which is called Relationship 101. So we send out 3 emails each week. 2 of those are for our paid subscribers. If folks want access to all of that, they can sign up at sexevangelicals.substack.com.
Awesome. So
Can I plug one other thing?
Oh, yeah,
of course you can.
If that feels like too scary and you're in the dip the toe situation, we are starting a monthly book club with a whole host of books around topics of sexuality, gender, relationships, fiction, nonfiction, memoir, journalism. And so if folks want to meet us or meet other people with similar experiences, and the idea of a coaching call or a therapy call is outside of the comfort zone, 1000% get that. You can also ask us about the book club. That might be an easier toe in.
And there's more info on that online, sexevangelicals.com.
Yes, and the link to your website will be in the show notes.
Amazing. Thank you.
One thing I do just want to clarify for people listening, because for us, we understand and it totally makes sense, but other people may not. Because you're licensed therapists, you're licensed in the state of Massachusetts. So if somebody wants to work with you in the context of a therapy session, they have to actually live in Massachusetts.
That's right.
Whereas coaching, you can coach anyone, anywhere around the world, right?
That's right.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I just want people to understand why there's a difference there.
And there's a whole other conversation that is that we could go into in a different podcast about that.
I'm well aware of that. I started doing this too late in life to have the desire to go back to school and get licensed. But when I started doing it, I realized that isn't actually the path I wanted to go anyway, because that limits the ability to do this work.
Sure.
And so in all kinds of ways. Yeah.
Certainly. All right. So one last thing before we finish up here. We are now going to practice a little bit of what we've been preaching throughout this show, because I have a question that I ask everybody that I interview at the end of this show, and you each get an opportunity to answer. And it is, what is your best sexual talent?
Ooh.
I am an amazing kisser. Kisser of all body parts, I might.
Very good. Do I need to cue the Jeopardy music here?
Well, I knew that because I've been listening to your podcast, I knew that you were going to ask that. I've been going back and forth around it.
There's no wrong answer.
You do have 4 or 5 really good options here.
I know. Thank you. I like to think that I have infinite sexual
Humility is
skills.
one of just kidding.
I am a great seducer,
You
I
sure
would
are.
say.
I would agree with that.
Awesome. Well, those are both great skills to have. And see, we just exercised for everybody the ability to talk about something of a sexual nature openly.
Indeed.
Yeah, I love that.
I like that. That's great.
All right. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. You guys were great. I really appreciated the information and the personal experience that you shared. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks
We
so much, Kevin.
really enjoyed our time with you. Thanks for all the work that you do too.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. That's all I have for this episode, and I will see you next week. I hope you liked this episode of the Love Lab podcast. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. And for more free exclusive content, join me in the Passion Vault at kevinandceline.com/vault. That's kevinandceline.com/vault. Thanks for listening, and remember, as Celine used to say, you're amazing.